With these original television apparatus now in the South Kensington Museum, we introduce Mr. John Baird, the inventor.
It is now 12 years since this apparatus showed the transmission of outline images to the public for the first time.
In 2002, the son of John Logie Baird returned to his old family home in Scotland for the first time in many years. He's looking for something.
Yes, there it is, JLB. JLB, now that would be done by my father with a diamond around about 1900. And I must have tried to emulate his effort, and that was me probably around 1948, MB.
In my own little way, I wanted the world to know who this man was and what he accomplished, and that he deserves the honor of being known for the rest of time, that he was the man who invented this great thing called television.
To me, and I think to a lot of people, he was simply a scientific genius.
In 1923, using string, cardboard, bicycle lamps, and the help of a childhood friend, John Logie Baird developed a method of seeing by wireless. This was the start of television technology. Within 20 years, he had perfected his invention, and in 1944, he demonstrated the world's first all-electronic, high-definition, three-dimensional color television receiver. As an imaging system, it was so far ahead of its time that it has taken 60 years to recreate. In a lifetime blighted with ill health, JLB, as he was known, produced 178 patents crucial to the technology that would define the 20th century.
Television is the technology, the fundamental technology, that runs the world today. It is at the basis of every single technology that you can imagine.
He just had an inner belief in the validity of what he was doing. And a lesser person would have perhaps simply taken his savings and retired to some quiet place on the coast. But my father wasn't like that. He kept on working. And the idea was that all this research would pay off eventually.
Since his early death in 1946, his achievement has been allowed to slip from view, obscured by ignorance about what he pioneered. Yet at one point in the 1920s, he alone held television in his hands, with an incredible vision that would amaze and unite the world. Few are aware that much of his greatest work was done in complete seclusion, in his personal laboratory, and entirely at his own expense. Details of his secret activities during World War II have never entered the public domain. John Logie Baird was born in 1888 in Helensburgh, a small, prosperous Scottish town on the River Clyde. His father was a church minister, and as a child the young Baird would often accompany his mother to deliver food parcels to those most in need. From an early age, he dreamt of making a device that would make it possible to transmit objects by wireless so they could be seen. It was an incredible idea that seemed as bold and impossible as putting a man on the moon. But he knew it could be done. By the time he was in his early 30s, with a qualification in electrical engineering under his belt and a series of merchant ventures in Glasgow and London behind him, JLB decided to join the international race to be first with television. He had no time to lose. In the winter of 1922, he was told by his doctor to leave London and head for the clean air of the coast if he was to live another year. His son now follows his father's footsteps as he returns to some of the defining locations in the story of JLB. John Logie Baird knew what it was like to be ill, and he knew acutely what it was like to be always cold and exhausted. But inside his head, ideas flowed as the rest of the world seemed to stand still. Cold intolerance is one of the classic symptoms of hypothyroidism, the undiagnosed condition which would afflict him for most of his life.
One thing most people notice about him was that he was always cold. He had a cold intolerance. Indoors he often wore an overcoat and scarf. In summer he wore an overcoat and scarf and a hat.
When he arrived in Hastings in the winter of 1922, JLB was gravely ill. With the help of one of his closest childhood friends, Mephi Robertson, he made his way to Linton Crescent. It was here that he would build his first working television machine.
As far as I understand it, Mephi had already had a room at the place. And my father came down and spent probably some number of weeks not really doing anything much, just trying to recover his health after London.
The move to Hastings had saved his life. Also helping him at this time and nursing him back to health was Alice, a woman who had come into his life in 1918. His relationship with Alice was just as unconventional as his experiments.
The person that we call Alice was a lady he met in 1918, and they fell in love, but they couldn't marry because he had virtually no prospects and he was always ill.
In an earlier attempt to regain his health and make his fortune in 1919, JLB had sailed to Trinidad, where he set up a jam-making factory. In 1920, while he was there, Alice married someone else.
He wrote on a slip of paper just the words, "Alice, where art thou?" And he returned from Trinidad in 1920, having lost 3/4 of his capital and with his health very much worse than it was before. He went up to Glasgow, where Alice was living, to see her and have things out. And it seems that he had things out also with her husband, because a sharing arrangement was agreed, and she lived partly with her husband and for several weeks or months at a time with Baird for the next 10 years, indeed until he married.
By the early 1920s, many different theories existed about how to achieve television. Scientists and companies in France, Germany, Italy, America, Japan, Hungary, and many others were all looking for the answer. Most notable was the theory proposed by Scotsman Archibald Campbell Swinton for an electronic system of transmitting and receiving using glass cathode ray tubes. But it was just a theory, and it had never been built or tried. JLB did not have the funds to experiment with electronic equipment and decided to pursue an idea derived from a German scientist, Paul Nipkow. Nipkow had patented a mechanical scanning device that would transmit and receive images using a disc with holes round the edge. But it too was just a theory that had never been made to work. As he walked over the cliff tops above Hastings on the way to a place called Fairlight Glen, JLB thought out a complete system employing Nipkow's idea. That afternoon, with Mephi's help, he set about collecting the material he would need: an old tea chest, a hat box, some needles, and a plentiful supply of sealing wax and glue. He would capture light, chop it up, and send it through space.
He built a very simple device, and what he was able to do was to send an image of a cross a distance of about 2 feet. This was strictly a silhouette. He had the Maltese cross, and this was visible over a distance of about 2 feet. This was by the end of 1923, a very primitive form of television.
Soon, JLB needed more room to continue his experiments into seeing by wireless, and moved his equipment to rooms above a shop in the center of Hastings. His early experiments were fraught with danger, and on one occasion he came close to killing himself. Not only were the experiments dangerous, the costs left JLB in dire need of finance. He found a partner in the astute London businessman Wilfred Day. In the course of their 18 months business relationship, the two men exchanged many letters as JLB tried to perfect his prototypes.
This is shortly after the explosion in Hastings. Dear Mr. Day, I had a very unpleasant experience, and I suppose should be thankful to be still alive. I got a shock from 1,000 volts. It twisted me up and flung me across the laboratory. Fortunately, nothing was damaged except my hands, which are badly burnt. The doctor was surprised that I was still alive.
Following the explosion, JLB was ordered to vacate the premises by his landlord. He decided instead to vacate Hastings altogether and headed back to London. He took over a small, cheap attic in Frith Street in Soho and continued his experiments. He was in poor health and had little money. He was about to make history that would change the world.
There were quite a number of people who were experimenting on the same sort of lines as his with mechanical scanning and sending silhouettes. And the principal person in this area was Charles Francis Jenkins in the United States, who had considerable financial backing, much more so than my father. But basically it was silhouettes. There was only black and white. There was no contrast. And my father saw that if television was to get anywhere, there had to be what you might call shades of grey in a picture. It wasn't enough just to have a black and white silhouette. And so he was working constantly towards this.
In an effort to keep going, in March 1925, JLB accepted an invitation to give a series of private demonstrations in Selfridge's department store in London's West End. The fee of 50 guineas would be used to fund his next experiments.
He had a breakthrough in October 1925 within the lab, and he achieved this half-tone picture with recognizable images of, first of all, Stooky Bill, his dummy, and then a young office boy from the floor below here in Frith Street.
In the autumn of 1925, JLB slipped out of London with the prototype of his mechanical invention and travelled to Falkirk in Scotland. He wanted a further trial that no one would know about before arranging his first public demonstration in London. A local schoolboy witnessed the events.
It was in the autumn of 1925, definitely. My night school teacher, he said to me, "Would you go down to the Temperance Cafe, where I understand there's going to be a demonstration of seeing by wireless?" So I went away down. Baird gave a talk, which I think was maybe about half an hour. He went into it very comprehensively. This is the scanning disc with its lenses. This is the second disc by which the light is further divided and passes into the light cell. Now, after the talk was over, he passed right by where the chair I was sitting on. He says, "Would you follow me?" Which I did. Now he says, "Would you sit on the projector?" Which I did. And I never saw the picture, but the audience saw it, and they said it was very like me. And that was really all there was to it.
I wanted to show my results to the world, to nail down at once that I was first. I was extremely nervous in case, while I waited, someone else achieved television and gave a show before I did. I knew that I'd stolen a march upon the scientific world, and that every attempt would be made to ignore my existence, to cast doubts on the authenticity of my demonstrations, and to use every method of implication and innuendo to belittle my work. The fact remained, however, that I was showing television, and no one else was able to do so.
In his British patent 269658, JLB outlined how he had mastered the flying spot scanning technique. Instead of using floodlights, he illuminated the subject by a single beam of light projected through the scanning disc. The reflected light was converted by a photoelectric device into a series of electrical signals and transmitted via aerial through the air. At the receiving end, the process was reversed, and the image was converted into a picture for viewing on a ground glass screen. When he applied the flying spot method to scanning images from film, the results were remarkable. As a technique, it remains fundamental to putting film content onto all televisions.
My father was always afraid that the large companies would find out about exactly what he was doing and then proceed to copy it. He tended to say very little, for example, about the photoelectric cells he was using in his equipment. He always focused on the rotating wheels, because these were very visible anyway, but he couldn't be drawn out on the precise nature of the photoelectric cells that he had.
Having protected his invention as far as he could by patent, JLB was now ready to invite members of the Royal Institution of Great Britain to 22 Frith Street. And on the 26th of January 1926, he became the first person in history to give a successful public demonstration of true television with proper shades of black and white. He had transmitted his prestigious guests from one room to another. The most powerful technology on Earth had arrived.
In one sense, it was the beginning of his problems. Just for the first few days, things looked very good. And then a company was formed, and there was a flotation on the stock exchange, and so money was no longer a problem. However, that in itself produced problems, because once you have a company, you have a board of directors, and they're all pulling in different directions. So that was the beginning of another type of problem, which my father hadn't faced before. He had always been a lone worker until Television Limited was formed.
In the very first publicity leaflet released by Television Limited, Baird's company, the whole concept of the medium was written down. This was a technology which would develop and ultimately spread through homes in every distant corner of the globe, offering incredible possibilities. It captured the public imagination and stimulated further research, not just in Britain but around the world. It was also a technology which JLB accurately predicted would have an incredible impact on modern warfare. Within weeks of his demonstration at Frith Street, the British Navy and Air Force had ceased their own research into television and awaited further progress from JLB. But Television Limited was barely off the ground when the competition caught up. On the 7th of April 1927, the Bell Laboratories in America also demonstrated mechanical television. They had sent pictures and sound 200 miles between Washington and New York. JLB had to come up with an answer, and fast. From his new laboratory at Long Acre, he responded with a series of world firsts that grabbed the headlines. On the 24th of May 1927, JLB and his assistant, Ben Clapp, transmitted from London to Glasgow. 6 months later, he transmitted from London to New York. He followed this by transmitting to the officers and guests on board the liner Berengaria in the middle of the Atlantic. The Bell Laboratories had used almost 1,000 men to achieve their demonstration. At this time, JLB only had Ben Clapp as his technical assistant. At Longacre, JLB developed Phonovision, the world's first television record and replay system, better known today as the video recorder. Then he moved the equipment outside for what he called daylight television.
My father used the rooftop as a sort of outdoor studio. A lot of the television was done indoors, but he was very keen to test his apparatus for outdoor operations, and so a sort of impromptu studio was set up here on the top floor. And the whole operation was carried out up against the side of the building. The television apparatus itself was not outside. The television apparatus was inside a temporary shed, and but the subjects sat outside in the open air.
In its simplest form, the daylight television apparatus could be used for detection. In 1928, JLB wrote an article outlining how, using reflected radio waves, a television imaging device could be used to detect and display on a screen distant metal objects, a concept that would later evolve into radar. Alongside the daylight television system was noctovision, that used infrared to see objects in the dark. Once again, JLB was years ahead of his time.
Well, up on the roof of Longacre, there was all the activity. And the ladies of Soho could see these nocturnal activities up there. And then they got round to Baird's daylight equipment, which was rather pointing in the direction of their bedroom windows. And they got a bit worried about this, thinking that television was a means of seeing what was happening. And so they sent a deputation round and, to make a complaint. And Baird invited them in and showed them what was happening, and one or two of them were televised, and they were convinced in the end that they couldn't possibly see into their bedroom windows. And before they departed, they offered their services as a stand-in, saying that we're much better looking than that ventriloquist dummy of yours, Stookie Bill. But I don't think they got very far, because the Baird typists heard about this. They said, we don't want those sort of women over here. We'll do those sort of jobs for you. We've got better legs anyway.
As the prospects of the company improved, JLB gave up living in hotels and cheap lodgings in London and moved to the Surrey countryside.
It's incredible. Fantastic.
Meffy, who had helped save his life in Hastings, was now in need of help himself and turned to JLB. He took over the running of the household and would discreetly move out into lodgings whenever Alice came to visit. By the end of the 1920s, the Baird Television Company was pouring its shareholders' money into research, staff, experimental programs and transmissions, and needed to persuade the BBC to launch a regular television service. The British Broadcasting Company began in 1922 as a private radio broadcaster and had become a public body in 1927.
Here is an instrument of almost incalculable importance in the social and political life of the community.
Supported by the biggest radio manufacturers, the BBC had a total monopoly of the airwaves. The man in charge was Sir John Reith.
Sir John Reith was a very frightening person. Baird was in awe of him as he was in awe of many people in authority. Also, according to Baird's autobiography, Reith had behaved very loutishly towards him at college. They were there at the same time. Reith really did behave very badly. Baird never forgot it, and I don't think that Reith forgot it either.
The two men had studied at the Royal Technical College in Glasgow before World War I and had got off to a bad start.
The lecturer had said something like, those who might be short-sighted or poor hearing, perhaps you would like to come down to the front and the others can move to the back. And immediately Baird thought it would be a good idea to move down to the front. And Reith stood up with 2 or 3 of his, and I can only say kind of bully boys at that time, and they said, where do you think you're going? Baird was going to invent television. Reith was going to make it very, very difficult for him to make use of the media.
Reith would not help Baird Television. JLB had to look elsewhere. And in June 1929 he accepted an invitation to broadcast from the powerhouse of European science, Berlin.
Well, the reason he went there was because the BBC wouldn't give him facilities for transmitting television in this country. So he came to an arrangement with the PTT people in Germany to use their premises and transmitter. So he took a crew over there, 4 people with all the equipment, and set up in the studios in Berlin.
Following Baird's demonstrations in Berlin, a new company was created to develop television under the auspices of the German Post Office, the Fernseh Company. The Baird Television Company were one of the 4 founding partners. In London, the Postmaster General, who controlled broadcasting for the British government, ruled that the BBC had to begin transmitting experimental television programmes. By September 1929, the BBC reluctantly conceded that it would, after all, transmit Baird television. But the Baird Company would have to pay the BBC for the use of its facilities. From a makeshift studio in Longacre, Baird Television Limited now began to broadcast the world's first regular experimental television programs. Comedy, music, sport, drama and cartoon films were part of television from the very beginning, even if it was only 30 lines of definition.
Well, people often ask what the entertainment value was of these early programs, bearing in mind the low definition and that sort of thing. But they rather missed the point, because never before could you see something happening at a distance instantaneously, and to see what was on the wireless as well as hearing what was on the wireless, was something which had a great appeal.
Many television enthusiasts began to build their own televisor kits, while the rest of the public could purchase the world's first mass-produced television set. The Baird Company now took television on the road and gave demonstrations of big-screen television in Stockholm, Paris, Berlin and London on an ingenious device powered by 2,100 light bulbs. JLB kept up his visits to Germany, and in 1931, while attending the Berlin radio show, he visited Manfred von Ardenne, a brilliant young scientist who had made a breakthrough in the use of cathode ray tubes for television.
Auch bei mir zum ersten Mal ein Fernsehbild auf dem Schirm einer Kathodenstrahler gesehen. Dieser Moment, dieser etwas historische Moment, ist sogar an einem Foto festgehalten damals.
Manfred von Ardenne's demonstration underlined the problems that JLB faced. He was unfamiliar with electronic equipment and methods, and the results from his own mechanical system seemed to offer the chance of success at this time. But while JLB was confident of success with television, his relationship with Alice was starting to look doomed. At the Baird Television Studios, he met a remarkable concert pianist, Margaret Albew, and a whirlwind romance followed. In October, the affair was interrupted by an invitation for JLB to go to New York. The possibility to expand business in America had come from Donald Flam, a radio broadcaster who had great plans for the first U.S. television network and saw JLB as the ideal partner.
We arranged through their representatives in New York to have him come to America, come to New York, and I had the joy and the pleasure, the honor of meeting him upon his arrival. A very soft-spoken man who thought deeply before he made any statements, very gentle, and when I met Mr. Baird, I realized this is the man I want to do business with. My station had the exclusive right to everything that was going on in the Madison Square Garden, including their fights every Friday night, the hockey games 2 nights a week, the 6-day bicycle races, and all kinds of theatrical events that took place there. WMCA and its network of stations were the only ones permitted to pick them up, and I looked forward, and so did Mr. Baird, to be able to actually show these things in addition to hear these things.
In November 1931, Flam and JLB gave evidence over 2 days to the Federal Communications Commission in support of Flam's application to broadcast programs using the Baird system. At the hearing, the examiner seemed impressed.
His decision came remarkably quick. Yes, by all means, grant them what they ask for, and he spoke very well. In his acceptance, he gave us considerable praise. However, we did not receive word from the FCC for 3 long, unbearable months.
The trip to Washington for the hearing turned out to be JLB's honeymoon. He had invited Margaret to New York to join him, and on her arrival, they decided to get married.
Here is a photograph that was taken of the wedding at the Half Moon Hotel on November 15th, 1931.
Margaret was 24 and JLB 43. On their wedding night, they composed a letter to Alice explaining the situation. America seemed to offer a bright future. With his new bride, JLB sailed back to Britain and returned to Box Hill to await the final ruling of the FCC. When it came, it brought his American plans to an abrupt halt.
The answer was no. Because, and I think I'm correct in saying, we want only Americans to be involved in television. It was a lost cause, and there was no sense trying, because unfortunately I had a few other experiences with the FCC that were equally unpleasant.
As a foreigner, neither JLB nor his technology was wanted. The path had been cleared for American television to become all-American. While he had been away in New York, Lord Ampthill, the chairman of Baird Television, continued the protracted BBC negotiations. In a historic letter, he called on the BBC to participate in the creation of a national public television service for Britain.
Together, they were trying to work out a system of public broadcasting which would last for some time. The problem was that the BBC were not very willing to have it at all. Now, this is a very responsible letter. Reith passed it to his senior staff, who acted as though they were outraged. Gladstone Murray even said in a memorandum to Reith, we feel that Lord Ampthill should be rebuked for the tone of his letter. They simply didn't see the impact that it was going to have. They thought and hoped that it might go away, but it didn't.
JLB's response was to prove just how popular television could be with the public. In June 1932, he put his reputation on the line when he transmitted the world-famous Epsom Derby horse race. It was his first demonstration of live cinema television.
I set up the equipment and operated it during the actual demonstration. It took me 3 days to set it up backstage at the Metropole. And I slept every night there because I daren't leave it once I set it up in case somebody interfered with it.
That was brilliant.
It was mechanical, but it certainly worked, and it was a landmark and a brilliant thing. I think he did it 2 years running. This was wonderful. So people were exposed to television, and he really forced the pace.
2 months later, the BBC reluctantly assumed responsibility for a regular television service using a 30-line system installed by the Baird Company. Eustace Robb was the man the BBC appointed to produce its first television programmes.
You have to remember the BBC was extremely reluctant to take on television. They didn't want it. They were pretty well forced to take it on by the government. And Eustace Robb was damned if he did and damned if he didn't. What I have here are photocopies of Eustace Robb's personal diary, which he kept from 1933 to 1935. It's never been seen before, and it's very revealing. It says very clearly, to start with, the difficulties he had. Meeting with Ashbridge, said he was against all 30-line transmissions being continued because it would encourage independent manufacturers to flood the market with 30-line receivers, thereby putting the corporation into a position of being unable to terminate 30-line transmissions when we thought fit.
Baird televisers sold in modest numbers, and viewers as far away as Denmark and Madeira tuned into a late-night 30-minute programme 4 times a week, broadcast on the medium wave. But the 30-line televisor could not compete with the prospect of high-definition pictures using cathode ray tubes. By 1932, JLB himself was now experimenting with cathode ray tubes, but the speed at which he was tackling the new technology was not sufficient for the company's new board members.
Matters came to a head in 1933 when a majority interest in the company was acquired by Gaumont British.
This is the Gaumont British News, presenting the world to the world.
As part of the shake-up, the Baird Company left Longacre and moved into new studio and manufacturing premises at the Crystal Palace in South London.
Now, as a result, Captain West was brought in to be technical director. Baird, while still retaining the title of managing director, set up his own personal laboratory at 3 Crescent Wood Road with initially one assistant, Paul Reevely.
He had a very sort of jaundiced idea of the people around him, particularly his co-directors. He could be very witty, but he was cynical without a doubt.
JLB's new private laboratory and home was about 10 minutes' walk from Crystal Palace.
There was a studio area and there was a viewing area for the reception. And if my memory serves right, there were some partitions coming across, so there were 2 or 3 different rooms. And it's all gone. It's all gone.
Baird would pay perhaps 1 or 2 visits a day to the laboratory, and he would always say, "Have you got anything to show me, Mr. Reevely?" And of course, as time went on, there was more to show.
Baird was not involved in any of the company's activities, but he assiduously maintained contact by attending board meetings and by going to the Baird laboratories in Crystal Palace to watch demonstrations.
He would come on not very often. I remember on one occasion he walked round the laboratories on his birthday, and I remember he'd come along and he'd ask us a great deal on what we were doing, but he never told us anything about what he was doing.
It wasn't just the new board that kept JLB under pressure. The radio manufacturers had woken up to the public appetite for television and were now rushing to stake their own claim. In Britain, EMI already had access to the television technology of the Radio Corporation of America via a patent swapping agreement. The Marconi Company also had growing expertise in the field. With the backing of RCA, the 2 British companies established a separate organisation, Marconi EMI. Marconi EMI and the Baird Company would now be in direct competition. The main problem that the Baird Company now faced was the lack of a cathode ray system of its own. The answer also came from America. Late in 1927, the inventor Philo T. Farnsworth had finally achieved Archibald Campbell Swinton's idea of using cathode ray tubes for television when he transmitted and received a white blob of light using his patented image dissector camera. By 1934, after considerable development, the Farnsworth image dissector camera was licensed for use by Baird Television. Television development was entering a new phase. It was a fact acknowledged by the British government in 1935, when it published a report announcing that trials would be held between Marconi EMI and the Baird Television Company. These trials would decide which system of television would be used by the BBC to deliver the world's first high-definition public television service.
The selection of a site for the first television station presented many difficulties of which the public know little. Eventually, the Alexandra Palace was chosen.
At the heart of the Marconi EMI electronic system was the iconoscope camera, originally produced by the Radio Corporation of America. It was clear that when RCA focused their considerable resources to develop television, they were a formidable force. Marconi EMI would use their expertise to offer 405 lines of definition for the BBC trials. The Baird Company, led by Captain West, would deploy 3 systems for evaluation: the Farnsworth electronic image dissector camera, the mechanical spotlight scanner for announcements, and Baird's intermediate film system. This recorded images and sound on film, which was then developed and transmitted 50 seconds later using the flying spot telecine and delivered images at 240 lines. The Baird Company quickly discovered that they had a major problem with the Farnsworth camera.
It scanned all right, but it didn't have sufficient light sensitivity.
An urgent SOS from Captain West brought Farnsworth over from Philadelphia to the Baird laboratories at Crystal Palace to help sort out the problems with his camera. Things were not going well at Crescent Wood Road either. JLB hosted a dinner party for Farnsworth, but Margaret was not there. Following the birth of her second child, Malcolm, in 1935, she had suffered a complete breakdown.
As a result, it was decided, and this must have been a very difficult decision for them both to make, that Margaret should go and stay with her mother in Sutton, about 12 miles away, taking Diana with her. She didn't take Malcolm as well because Granny Albu, Cecilia Albu, Margaret Baird's mother, didn't like little boys. Now that situation continued for 2.5 years, with the couple being separated. Baird rang up his wife Margaret at 9 o'clock every evening, but they hardly saw each other, but the children went from one place to the other to see each other.
Preparations at Alexandra Palace for the high-definition trials continued during 1936, with the 2 companies installing and testing their equipment. But JLB was isolated from the process. The problems with the Farnsworth camera continued, and it was withdrawn for more testing. The public launch of the BBC high-definition trials in November 1936 marked the opening of the world's first public service television operation. It was an historic event. But Sir John Reith, the Director-General, avoided any involvement. He was away on holiday in Scotland. And at the opening ceremony, JLB was snubbed.
The BBC at that time, could have done a lot more for him, and he was particularly upset that in the opening of the Alexandra Palace, Instead of being up on the platform with the other dignitaries, he was down amongst the journalists and pressmen, and that hurt him considerably. I mean, you couldn't imagine a situation in Italy where they were opening a radio station and Marconi, instead of being up on the platform, was pushed on one side. And that was very bad, really, and I think he was quite hurt about it.
Despite the fact he was a shy man, he was actually a very fine publicist. And without the belief that Baird had that television was the future, television would not have progressed at the speed it came. It is extraordinary to think that the BBC was founded in 1922 with the infant radio. And then, only 14 years later, we had high-definition television, which we would recognise today. It's breathtaking speed. We think things move fast today with computers and so on, and indeed they do. But when you think of the trick of solving the problems of television technology in that time frame, it is quite mind-blowing.
3 weeks after the BBC launch, Baird Television stared disaster in the face.
The trouble with the South Tower is that another little tower seems to have broken out. The South Tower is the one where the Baird television were.
I certainly remember looking at the wreckage, the molten glass and all the rest of it, and going to look at my own, Baird's part of the equipment, which was in the South Tower and which had survived.
In the wreckage, Farnsworth retrieved a piece of molten glass. It was all that was left of his ill-fated image dissector camera.
Because it greatly affected the company, who all their spare parts for the Alexander Palace and everything were all destroyed.
For the Baird Company, things got worse. On the 16th of December 1936, the Television Advisory Committee called for the trials to be abandoned and for the Marconi EMI system to be adopted. However, the BBC would retain Baird's flying spot telecine in order to broadcast pre-shot film material. Despite all the setbacks, the Baird Company would rebuild, a decision that would have a profound impact on Britain's ability to defend itself in wartime. Using Farnsworth's basic system, they would improve it beyond recognition.
After the fire in 1936, the rotunda had been fitted up to manufacture cathode ray tubes. And it was a modern, very modern plant. These were the largest tubes available. Most other companies were making smaller tubes. But Baird had the decision to make large tubes. It was one of the big decisions and correct decisions they made.
While Britain now had a new public television service, in Germany since 1935, television had been a state secret and under the control of the Air Ministry. Fernseh, which JLB had helped to create in 1929, was forcibly taken over, and all foreign ownership was forbidden. In the purges that followed, a brilliant Jewish scientist escaped from Berlin with his life and made his way to London and then to Baird Television. His work in specialized photosensitive coatings would prove vital to JLB, the Baird Company, and later, the British war effort. His name was Alfred Sommer. Sommer's work for the Baird Company aroused the interest of the German authorities. In July 1938, a visitor arrived at the rotunda in the grounds of Crystal Palace. What their visitor inadvertently revealed would have a huge effect.
When I got there on the Monday morning, it was a Dr. Hyman who came. He came from the Fernseh company, we think, and also possibly the Zysikon company. And he came to introduce us to a new photosurface in which antimony and cesium was used.
The visitor from Germany had discovered that the chemical elements antimony and cesium, when mixed, delivered a powerful reaction to light. This would become the key to electronic color television. It was information offered in the false hope that the laboratory secrets of Baird television would be unwittingly revealed.
He spent the day with us, told us all about the technique, and then he left the following day. Well, the following day, Sommer attempted to repeat what we had been shown, and to our astonishment, it produced a superb photoelectric device. It was a terrific breakthrough. Hyman, who came over, no doubt, to find out what Sommer was doing, made us a present of a photoelectric surface that was to be used widely through the war. And what it did, it triggered Sommer into doing research on alternative surfaces. And he immediately made everyday tubes using different materials, which of course was immensely valuable for Baird, John Logie Baird, who was working at Crescentwood Road looking for colour television.
Meetings of the Baird Television Board had become intolerable, and at his own request, JLB was given permission not to attend. The board was relieved. To them, losing the main contract to supply the BBC was an opportunity to concentrate on delivering high-quality television sets to the public. For some time in his laboratory, JLB had been working on a new concept to take television to the people: cinema television in colour. He planned to transmit colour television from the surviving South Tower at Crystal Palace to the jewel in the crown of the Gaumont cinema chain, the Dominion Theatre in London's West End.
And our picture was more or less on eye level, on a translucent screen which was dropped down from the fly tower. The colour was surprisingly good. It was only two colour really, but it gave a good illusion.
In February 1938, using an elaborate mirror drum mechanical colour camera and a mirror drum projector, JLB and his principal assistant Paul Reevely undertook a unique experiment. They would be the first in the world to demonstrate colour cinema television to the public.
This is where I used to sit to watch my own picture, and JLB on the right here.
I think Baird only gave just two demonstrations, one in December 1937 and the main one in February 1938, and after that it was dismantled, and he did spend a tremendous amount of money on demonstrations which only took place once or twice.
In America, JLB's colour system was seen initially as the solution to delivering colour television. It was based on the principles of mixing red, green and blue light, which he had first patented and demonstrated in 1928.
Basically, you can turn a black and white camera into a colour camera very simply. Take a single frame through a red filter, and you'll get a black and white picture. Transmit it, it's black and white, received on the set, black and white, put it through the red filter again, and you're red. Blue, green. And spin it round fast, and of course, at 25 frames a second, you get red, blue, green, and seen with colour persistence, you get colour. Here, you have your cathode ray tube, it's black and white. It projects down through a colour wheel which turns like that, onto a convex mirror, back through the colour wheel, back through here, onto the mirror and projects forward. It's pure Baird. This set was produced by CBS in 1946. As such, it's the oldest known colour television set in the world. It was a commercial failure. They couldn't get sponsorship, and after 108 days they pulled the plug on this system. But field sequential television actually came back into its own from the first colour transmissions from the moon, which used field sequential colour transmission, one colour after another, exactly as Baird did it in 1928.
By the summer of 1938, the future of Europe was starting to look uncertain. the Baird Company embarked on secret Project 4141 for the French government.
Well, the Baird Company had a contract from the French Air Ministry to equip a Marcel Bloch bomber with a television, and EMI had a similar contract. EMI, of course, had a good camera, but the Baird Company didn't have a suitable electronic camera, so they used the intermediate film system, where they used an ordinary 16mm camera and developed and fixed the film on the plane in about 50 seconds. And it was then turned into television signals with a telecine and transmitted through a television transmitter, which was my responsibility, to the ground. It was, in fact, the first transmission of live television pictures from the air.
The fortunes of the Baird Company were beginning to revive, and it was on the point of making a profit when, on the 1st of September 1939, the BBC suspended all television broadcasts for fear that the signals from Alexandra Palace would be used to guide enemy bombers into the heart of London. Gaumont British put Baird Television into receivership. JLB's job in the company ceased to exist.
The war broke out on September the 3rd, and within 24 hours my father had us on a train heading west. He looked at the map, and one of the most westerly points of the railway was the terminus at Bude, and it was remote from the Channel ports, which might have been bombing targets. And we were checked into a hotel, and my mother had the job of looking for a permanent place to stay. And there we stayed for about 5 years. We were in Bude here for 5 years. My father himself, of course, went up to London every 3 or 4 weeks and went on with his work. He lived on at the old house in Sydenham, but we were in Bude for the duration.
JLB was now effectively a free agent. He had £15,000 in his own bank account, and he would use these funds to continue with his own experiments. At Crystal Palace, his old company was facing an uncertain future.
After war was declared, there were only, I think, 42 people in the entire company. 42. Everybody else went.
Early in the war, the converted French Bloch bomber was captured by the advancing German army near Toulouse. But there was another application for television in wartime.
Well, there was, of course, a great need of television people for radar. I mean, radar and television are technically almost the same. And many of us were approached by the Admiralty, who were a bit behind the Air Ministry on radar. So most of the company went on to radar.
In May 1940, the remaining Baird television staff were taken over and re-employed by its subsidiary company, Cinema Television Limited, which in turn had been acquired by the Rank organization. In the company of Captain West, JLB was a frequent visitor to the secure facilities which were now guarded by part of the Free French Army, garrisoned on the grounds of Crystal Palace. Over the next 5 years, Cinema Television Limited worked in total secrecy on vital government contracts for the Allies. These included over 110,000 radar cathode ray tubes, special radio receivers for jamming enemy signals, proximity fuses for anti-aircraft shells, and over 30,000 unexploded bomb and mine detector kits. Later in the war, these were flown direct from Crystal Palace for immediate deployment at the Battle of El Alamein and at the D-Day landings. They would also prove essential at the end of the war for clearing over 10 million landmines scattered across France. In London, the facilities became a target.
In the flying bomb era, girls were killed waiting at the bus stop outside. But you've got to realise that these cells were made during the height of the Blitz, and the girls, many of them lost their homes, but they'd come into work the next morning. We operated it with high security, but the girls were never told what they were making. No one knew.
The input of all scientists to the war effort was underpinned by total secrecy, and JLB was no exception.
It is said that there were some meetings of, informal meetings of government experts and military experts, which were held every week in a very informal basis. These were known as the Sunday Soviets. The word Soviet means that everyone was very democratic and they didn't stand on rank. And these would typically be held in country places around London. And it is said that one of these Sunday Soviets took place right here in the house, possibly in late 1939. There's some evidence.
It is believed that one of those in attendance was the man described as the scientist with the most power in history, Frederick Lindemann, Winston Churchill's close personal friend and scientific advisor during World War II. It had been Lindemann's intervention that had secured the crucial war work at the Rotunda. By the spring of 1941, JLB had a staff of 2 and a fully equipped laboratory. But Crescent Wood Road in South London was not a safe place to be. To confuse incoming bombers, the surviving tower at Crystal Palace was demolished as the indiscriminate bombing of London intensified. At Crescent Wood Road, the windows were all blown out and most of the ceilings had collapsed. The strain on JLB was obvious, and in May 1941, depressed and in bad health, he suffered a heart attack. Following his health scare, JLB underwent a drastic cure, and over the next 3 months, as he made his recovery, his weight plummeted. But while his physical health slowly improved, his financial state remained of great concern. At the end of July 1941, he went to see Cable and Wireless, the company that had sole responsibility for all of Britain's wartime telegraphic communications. He accepted an offer to act as a consulting technical advisor. He would explore the use of television for secure high-speed facsimile signaling, and the salary would fund the wages of his 2 staff and keep the family imbued.
Among the various pictures, this one is probably the most significant. It doesn't look like very much. It's a portrait of an elderly gentleman, or late middle-aged gentleman, whom we've identified as Sir Edward Wilshaw, who was the chairman of Cable and Wireless. And so what we have here is a cine photograph of Wilshaw's image on a television screen scanned with 180 lines. Facsimile television is sending single images in rapid succession. So this is just a single image, like a still picture, which could be sent in 1/25th of a second. And so this is the only fast facsimile image that I know of that exists.
As the war progressed, Alfred Sommer and Gilbert Tomes would visit Crescent Wood Road. Encouraged and supported by JLB, Sommer had perfected the colour photosensitive ingredients that JLB needed to perfect what would become his masterpiece.
I used to go with Sommer, largely because I had a car and Sommer hadn't. But we'd go there and we'd chat to him about the tubes. And he was very interested in what we were doing. He didn't know anything about practical vacuum physics, but he knew where the electrons were and what they were doing, and was busy inventing large numbers of things using all kinds of surfaces and devices.
I think one must remember that Baird paid for all his initial research into television, and he paid for all his latter research out of his own pocket. That latter research was some of the most astonishing things he ever did.
patent 562168, application date July 42, and he got the specification accepted in June 44. An extremely important patent. This effectively is the world's first all-electronic, full-colour, 600-line, although it was capable of going to much higher than that because we know from other Baird patents, and it's the famous telechrome. Now this is not only all-electronic 600-line high-definition colour, it's stereoscopic colour as well.
From the beginning of his earliest mechanical experiments in the 1920s, JLB had tried to perfect stereoscopic three-dimensional imaging. With a modification to the telechrome that would split the image into a right-eye view and a left-eye view, JLB was able to demonstrate outstanding, fully immersive three-dimensional images that could be viewed without the need for special glasses. 60 years after it was first demonstrated by JLB, the concept is now being developed in the US and the UK for use in a wide range of three-dimensional imaging applications from medicine to museums. In July 1944 at Crescent Wood Road, JLB demonstrated the capabilities of the telechrome to the Hankey Committee, which had been formed to investigate the future of television after the war on behalf of the British government. Evidence was taken from all the major industrial interests and from one private individual, John Logie Baird. Many of his proposals were accepted in the subsequent white paper as the long-term objective for post-war television. These included the end of the BBC monopoly and the creation of an independent television service, extending the range of transmission beyond London, and the introduction of an international technical standard for television. The government also endorsed Baird's idea that post-war television should be improved to at least 1,000 line definition and be in 3D.
All these things could have been greatly developed had he lived a bit longer, had he lived after 1946. But as it was, the leadership passed to other countries, particularly the United States.
At the end of 1944, the Baird family was once again on the move and settled at 1 Station Road, Bexhill-on-Sea on the south coast of England. With the help of his old friend, the actor Jack Buchanan, a new company, John Logie Baird Limited, was formed. JLB was poised to shape the future of post-war television.
We came in, the whole family came in sometime in, I think it was early 1945. The danger from bombs had passed, and in fact we were living in Bexhill, and we spent a day in London, and my father had the high-definition colour television working, and we got a chance to see it. And the subject was Eddie Anderson, who was simply standing there in his shirt sleeves, puffing at his pipe, and one could even see the smoke from his pipe. Everything was very realistic. And this was high definition. We couldn't see any lines on the picture or anything like that. And I recall it was a very bright colour. The picture was almost brighter than the original. And that would have been in early 1945.
In early 1946, JLB was invited by the Air Ministry to attend the interrogation of a captured German television expert. It had turned out that the prisoner had previously visited the Baird laboratories in 1938. It was Dr. Walter Heimann, formerly of the Fernseh Company. JLB was too ill to be at the debriefing. In February, he suffered a stroke. Over the next few months, he gradually regained strength, and at the beginning of June 1946, was coordinating by phone the screening of the Allied Victory Parade in 2 London cinemas and at the Savoy Hotel. Sir Edward Wilshaw was relieved to learn that his friend was better, and wrote to JLB requesting tickets to view the televised events on the specially built Grosvenor receiver. It was the largest television that had ever been built. The screening would mark the return of JLB to public television for the last time.
There were demonstrations of television in 2 London cinemas and also at the Savoy Hotel. I think it was a 28-inch screen on which the Victory Parade was shown. This occurred on the 7th of June, 1946. 1 week later, my father died in his sleep.
JLB was 57. His bank account was almost empty. But he left behind something much more precious than money.
Well, it's been a great mystery as to what happened to the equipment which Baird used at the Dominion, and also his wartime telechrome tube. And it was at Crescentwood Road, I was told by people who worked there during the war. But then it vanished. Now, how something of that size could disappear, you don't know. But it's a mystery and a great pity that none of this stuff has survived.
The telechrome was the foundation for all modern electronic colour television as we know it today. It was the outstanding swan song of a genius and individual inventor, aided by a part-time glassblower and 1 assistant.
It's outrageous that Baird's recognition has never been achieved. The big question is, why has he been neglected?
In America, citing the telechrome as prior art, RCA launched colour television in 1954, after $75 million of expenditure and the research effort of thousands of scientists.
If you think about what Baird had to offer then and what we have now, why don't we have 3D colour television? Why are we waiting for that?
John Logie Baird was the last of the great private inventors, and he remains the central figure in the history of television and its development. He came from nowhere, took an impossible scientific and technical proposition and made it work. And when he died 20 years later, he left behind the blueprint for colour television and 3-dimensional imaging. After the Second World War, as JLB predicted, television spread to homes in every distant corner of the globe. Those who took television and its associated technologies forward were rewarded with unprecedented power, finance, and honours. But it was JLB who had shown the way in peacetime and wartime, and given them many of the practical tools and ideas that they needed to go forward. At the end of the 1920s, he could have sold his company for a fortune, but declined the chance because he had no idea what he would do with the money. There was only one place JLB was happy. A laboratory, he once wrote, with all the apparatus I wanted, was to me a perfect paradise. He might have added that it was also the perfect place from which to see the future.